Welcome everybody to the CEO Leadership Forum webinar, Tackling Risk in Turbulent Times. My name is Fernandez. I'll be hosting you for the next 60 minutes. Okay, for those of you unfamiliar with the CEO Leadership Forum, we're a group of business people who have come together. You can see some of the logos there to form a strategic relationship between businesses in our area, Valencia Community College, students that go there in order to provide businesses with a strong talent pool, give leaders opportunities to learn, grow, and share. That's what we're doing today, and offer scholarships to deserving students at Valencia College. Now, a moment of acknowledgement for all our attorneys everywhere as we offer this disclaimer. The views, comments, and opinions of our panelists are theirs and theirs only, and not intended as professional advice. For everyone's particular situation, we recommend you seek competent professional help. We've had tremendous response to our webinars and want to make sure you know that we'll offer another one on Thursday, July 9th. We'll make mention of this again before the end of the meeting today. Today, we're going to have a dynamic conversation between you and the panelists. We've already received some questions and ask that you put your questions in the Q&A area available to you, and we'll get to as many as we can today. The chat feature is for talk amongst yourself and compliments for the host, but the Q&A feature is for questions, particularly for our team. But I'm going to challenge the audience today in the form of a story. There was an old man that owned a farm, and he had a couple nephews visiting him. He called both over and took them to the barn and showed them identical stalls filled primarily with hay and horse manure. The first one looked at it, disgusted, and said, "I'm out of here. This is gross. I'm leaving." The second boy jumped in excitedly and said, "Wow, with all this horse manure, there's got to be a pony somewhere." Well, we know that the topic of risk management and so on is usually either negative or simply compliant. Today, Joe and Ashish, who I'll introduce you to in a second, will show you how you can view risk in a strategic way and one that can deliver ponies to your future. So with that, let me introduce our panelists today. Joe Herman is the Senior Vice President of Transactional Risk at HYLANT, having worked as a CFO for several middle market companies in the Midwest, after prior serving as a senior manager with Ernst & Young, shortly after earning his MBA from Notre Dame. So we welcome Joe and his insight. Joe, glad to have you. Secondly, we have Ashish Chauhan from our private equity mergers and acquisitions group that also deals with alternative risk. An engineer by training with a law degree to boot, Ashish has worked in the risk and insurance marketplace for over 20 years with global firms such as AIG, Aon, and Marsh. So with that, let's go to the agenda and talk about what we're going to accomplish in this session. We're going to give you a market update and get some perspective of what's going on in the risk and insurance world, evaluate your approach to risk, see how risk influences cash, and risk's impact on M&A. Finally, what's next and what actions can you take to go forward? I believe we have a polling question. If we could have that up on the screen. All right, if you can answer this, you'll see this pop up on your screen, everybody. How does your, well, on the screen, the question is COVID-19. So let's go with the one on the screen that just popped up. How has COVID-19 impacted your strategic view of your organization? Are you going to restructure? Are you going to acquire and grow? Are you looking to sell or recapitalize? All of the above, none of the above. If everybody could take a moment and click on whichever box or boxes are appropriate to them, that would be great. We'll give you about 20 more seconds to answer those questions. Okay, so the results, the preliminary results are in. We have, how has COVID-19 impacted your strategic view? Restructuring, almost 40%. Acquiring and growing, almost 50%. Interesting, not one person said selling or recapitalizing. Good for the group. All of the above, 8%, and none of the above, 15%. So interesting thought on that. Ashish, with that as a backdrop, I know we've had a couple different questions pop up. Would you please take it away?
Fantastic. Thanks, Casey. And thank you for the CEO Leadership Forum for having us this morning. Hope to have some good dialogue. And actually, it's nice to show up with such optimistic responses to that first polling question. So that's good to hear. But what an interesting time we're living in, right? Starting with the wildfires of Australia and then the craziness of the start of the election year and the UK withdrawing from the EU. That's just January, I was recapping. Throwing in the pandemic and loss of sports for months and months. Schools and colleges closing and canceling, people working from home, and to top it off, I think we have murder hornets invading us in parts of the country. So, and I know this is going to be a year where anything could happen because on a road trip last weekend, on a 90-mile road trip, the air conditioning in my car went out on a very hot day. So that's just 2020 for you in a nutshell, I guess, right? But lots of good things that have happened this year, right? SpaceX sent a rocket up into space, first time a U.S. rocket that's going to be reusable. That successfully launches and people get to spend time with their families. So I think that's a good thing. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. No polling question here for that, but I'm sure people will have some unique answers. And for the economy, nothing's making sense, right? Bad news of such severe magnitude is being balanced with the stock market delivering such good news of equal magnitude. But as a business owner or executive, you're seeing your own color of reality. And through the lens of risk, we're going to share with you some thoughts that should hopefully be relevant as you ask yourself, where can I go from here? So as hard as it may be to believe, the economy is something we've seen before, but let's revisit history and connect the dots as it relates to the insurance marketplace. So you see here on your screen a chart, Dow chart here, and I've highlighted some notable timeframes here. So we've got at the turn of the century where you have the dot-com and the dot-com bust and 9/11. So you have two big events where you have a bubble building up with a lot of stock market valuations, then realizing that because of that, there's some misalignment of company valuations relative to business activities, right? If you remember pets.com and a lot of other things. So that bubble builds up and, we've got through the year 2000 okay, but then 9/11 happened and that sort of helped become the catalyst that popped that bubble. Multiple shocks to the insurance marketplace. And the insurance marketplace responds by saying, you know what? We no longer can believe in cash flow underwriting where they were underwriting insurance just for the cash flow, not really worrying about the risk that they were taking on. And they said, we got to change that. So change it, they did. Then you go to 12 years ago, you've got the financial crisis. And now you have a new set of issues where over leverage of current credit forces a seizure in the available liquidity in the economy. And so what happens is you have issues of solvency. And that, that brought AIG to that whole point of too big to fail and that whole analysis. And what resulted from that was this significantly important financial institution designations as well too. But risk underwriting, that changes because now insurance companies say, okay, there's other things that we hadn't thought about that we need to start thinking about. And those changes come into the marketplace about 12 years ago. And that brings us to where we are today. We've got the worldwide pandemic, where we've got that worldwide shutdown of the economy and lots of confusion and questions as related to like, well, what is this? Is this really a loss or not? Everyone's impacted. And so when you get to a pandemic, it's no longer just a distribution of shared risk. It's everyone having the exact same risk and various responses to that. So how's the insurance company industry respond to that? Well, that response is still emerging, and we'll see what we can do to help you navigate that. With that as a backdrop, you see insurance really had, to deal with that and all the other issues that, insurance had to deal with over as part of the regular function. So you see Hurricane Andrew and a couple of other named storms, as recently as 2017 with Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And those are the things that are, significant events that happen. And you can see the magnitude of that has grown over time where 20, 30 years ago, Hurricane Andrew, the value to the insurance industry was about $41 billion in loss, to the combined efforts of Harvey, Irma, and Maria that resulted in $111 billion impact to the industry. So, and you can see here that over time, the average losses grow from what was $5 billion back in the 80s as being a significant loss to now the average being $35 billion. So think about that. such growth in a generation that impacts the industry. But the thing is, you don't need to worry about the insurance industry. They're still making money. What I have up here is a chart that illustrates combined ratio, which is a way the insurance industry measures whether or not they're profitable. Basically, the way to understand this is if you look at that index of 100, anything above 100 means that for every dollar of premium an insurance company collected, they paid out more than a dollar in losses. And so anything below that means they collected a dollar in premium, but paid out less than a dollar in losses, therefore resulted in a profit. Over a 10-year span, you can see that they've made money in more years than they didn't. So, black swans. What is a black swan? It's a surprise that has a major impact, and it's thought of something as being obvious after the fact. In the early Roman times, it was something that was used as sort of a metaphor to say that this answer does not exist. It's the existence of a black swan. And for up until 1600, people didn't realize that black swans didn't exist until in the 1600s, where black swans were found in Australia. And then when they realized this, they reflected upon it and said, well, of course, black swans do exist. And it was obvious. We should have known that all the time. But it's not something that conventional wisdom can prepare you for. I mean, there's many, leading up to the pandemic, there was many calls to prepare for the pandemic, but clearly the world's response showed that the series of events leading up to the world's response was a surprise. So these low probability, high impact events, which are impossible to predict, definitely are growing in latent presence, right? The world is interconnected. You have the internet, you have world travel, information flowing with minimal resistance. And this facilitates a set of circumstances where more black swan events can occur. So think about all the black swans we've seen in just my lifetime. And I'm including the Cubs winning the World Series as one of those events as well, too. But the one thing you can predict with confidence, companies should not ignore black swan events because of the fear of bad things can result. So knowing that black swans exist, what can you do about it? So I'll give you 3 points and then something to think about here. So 1, don't predict what the next black swan is. You're just not going to be able to do it. Focus on the consequence of events and plan from there. If a small perturbation, like a small drop in demand, can impact your business, then certainly you're not going to be able to absorb large changes. In your personal life, you buy some insurance and you worry about the major events and its consequences later. But in business, you treat insurance like an option, and you just can't always do that. You have to be prepared to accept the risk or buy insurance to hedge against it. Second point, hindsight is not foresight. Black swans don't have predecessors. 9/11 is sort of a parallel example. I mean, I suppose if you try hard enough, you can find a precedent, but black swans just don't have precedents. They're just growing. There's so many variables growing, and it increases the randomness. So there's just no way to measure what a typical successful response to a black swan event would be or a typical failure to a black swan event. And the last point, understand the math and how that fits into the psychological risk-bearing capacity. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. If you were told that you have a probability of losing all your money once in every 30 years, you would go through a certain decision-making framework and come up with some sort of outcome on the other end. But what if, in contrast, somebody told you that you would have a 3.3% chance of losing a little bit of money every year for the next 30 years? Think about it. The math is the same, but your psychological thoughts behind that differ over time. So the takeaway is how to understand how the risk is being presented to you, so you're not guided to a decision where the math is framed a certain way. So let me take a moment there. I mean, thoughts about that, Joe, Casey, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think as we get into the meat of strategic risk planning, the point that AC is making is use risk management and think about it to not overreact and make some short-term decisions, just like you do with your business. And oftentimes risk management is one of those items that people overreact quickly and maybe make some short-term decisions that they really didn't need to have to make. if they were anchoring themselves against a strategic plan. We'll talk about that.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Maybe you don't want to overreact, but you want to use this as a time of opportunity, right? What are your 3-year, 5-year, 10-year growth plans, and what, if anything, needs to change? Can you shift into an offensive mode, which and make decisions that will drive growth and bring you into markets that you haven't penetrated before? Do you have the deal capital that can help facilitate this? What investments can you make that will help you grow your business? Or do you need to be in a defensive measure or a defensive posture and preserve cash? What does your enterprise need to do to reduce expenses or shed operations, or what decisions do you need to make to help it survive? I mean, thinking about your business strategy is really something you should do at all times. But using a opportunity after our Black Swan event gives you a new framework and new perspective to look at this. The other thing to do is investments into your business. Maybe you need to shift your business. If you're a restaurant that's in a delivery and dine-in mode, maybe you want to look at it where you want to say, hey, maybe I should just shift to delivery only. And maybe you'll have this time to create new partnerships, and that can result in new business opportunities for you going forward. So at that,
okay, we have another polling question here, Ashish. If Jeff, you could bring that up. All right, in your individual organization, who has ownership over risk management? Is it, number one, a C-level strategic objective? All company leaders are involved and must address risk management. Number two, just the CFO or maybe the general counsel has ownership and they report to the C-suite. Third, you outsource risk management perhaps to your insurance broker. And the fourth is risk what? So you've got four questions, different levels of involvement or ownership for risk management. Please pick one and send that in. So go ahead and submit that now. It'll be interesting to see the results. I think from conversation, Joe, that you and I have had, that the majority of middle market companies, small to medium-sized businesses, typically view risk management as simply a compliance thing and don't have a strategic plan put together to go forward. Is that right?
That's right.
Well, looks like, I'm sorry, looks like our group is at the head of the class here. Almost 2/3 have C-level strategic objectives that all leaders are involved and must address, which is awesome. So we're probably preaching to the choir here, with about a little less than 1/3 has the CFO or general counsel has ownership and reports to the C-suite, and a few people outsource this. Any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, that is a good fact pattern if you're actually operationalizing that. And, having been a CFO at a couple of different organizations, typically the financial person takes the lead at coordinating and administering, the math and the compliance element of that. But they're usually the people working through the other disciplines to get one-off input and putting things in place. But what we want to talk about is, are you taking the time to really look at your holistic investment in risk management? And I think as we go here, and AC, you can go to the next slide, it's a perfect transition into how are you looking at, as business leaders, and for those of you who have clients, how are you really looking at risk management, not only in terms of your resources and expenses that you are spending on an annual basis or multi-year. But this optic that we're just going to speak to is sometimes, and my experience is often, people don't add up the total amount of time and resources that are spent in the risk management space. Over on the left-hand side, when you think of people and processes, if you happen to have a board or key advisors that help you running the company, they're spending time thinking about risk management. And that's just not property and casualty, that's overall risk, including employee benefits and other related activities. Your functional leaders, it seems like this group has a nice fit of cross-functional leaders managing risk. That's really what you want to aspire to. What we found at times is that those cross-functional leaders may not all be in the same room at the same time. Maybe the CEO or the CFO is talking to each other individually and talking to your HR leader or your ops leader or your sales leader, but when do you bring them together in the same room for a discussion on risk? Your frontline staff obviously is important. We're always very cognizant and we're keeping our people safe inside our facilities, or your service professionals. And so they're leading in risk management, which is why you have to put into processes. So you're investing dollars in training, you're investing dollars in safety. You may be investing dollars in capturing data and metrics. All of those things are investments that may be showing up separately in your P&L or in other people's budgets outside of the risk management or insurance line item on your financial statements. And then externally, where you find is, well, my spend on insurance premiums is my investment in risk management, whether it's a property and casualty, whether it's your employee benefits as you evaluate that, or your directors and officers, cyber, all those types of premium dollars that you're spending, that's direct costs. And clearly then, as you move over to your suppliers, you have to go through a process because your suppliers do bring risk into your organization, and you need to protect yourself from anything that may impact your ability to serve your customers. Or you may be using third-party vendors for IT, finance, and HR, where if they're not doing the proper things, they can have a significant negative impact, which is risk for you. I think the moral of this story is when you add up all of these things, have you done the math? Our experience is that you could have as much as 10 to 15% of your annual spend in this space when you do a full cost of total risk.
Just I have a quick question, a quick question, Joe. One, we had someone raise their hand, Penny, in the forum. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to answer your question. Secondly, Joe, this seems pretty involved, and I think it was brought up by another person that sometimes we can be blinded by being so close to it. In other words, you can't see the forest for the trees. Who have you found is helpful in walking organizations through this so they get a true evaluation of their risk versus, just doing it themselves necessarily, or just not getting a holistic picture?
Well, I think there's a couple of depending upon your organization, how they're structured, there's a couple of different people that you can use to help you with this. First and foremost, your leadership team. You're choosing hopefully the right players, and if they get more educated and you gather them together to have a conversation, that's always to do it organically. They know best and they can feed through it. Having been through strategic planning processes, and you have advisors that may help you come through and take the organization through strategic planning processes, what we've suggested is the area of risk management can be an area that facilitates a lot of cross-functional conversation. How your VP of HR or your HR director is really working through the benefits package may drive significant or does drive significant impact of your operations leaders' ability to hire the right people, because maybe your benefits package is not as important as it needs to be, or maybe is not at market. And so when you're going through the strategic planning process, make sure risk management is part of that. And then finally, you have other advisors, whether it's your accountants or firms like ourselves, that are risk advisors. Hold them accountable to bring you advice to think more holistically and multi-year approach. You have to get through the annual expense process, but have them think broader, which is sharing with them your strategic views.
I'm curious, Joe, from your experience, or Ashish, you can chime in. what percentage, I mean, it showed that almost two-thirds of our participants today have try and do a strategic analysis across the board. But what, from your experience, what percentage of people leverage their advisors, whether it be their outside counsel, their accounting firm, their insurance broker, and actually hold their feet to the fire to bring them help and assistance on these items?
Our experience has been, especially in what we define as the lower middle market, the organizations do not ask as much as they should be asking out of their advisors. And I would say, so in terms of percentages, I would tell you 1/3, no more than half, Casey, are really getting the entire benefit out of their advisory network that they can bring to the table, because they just don't know that it exists, or their advisor doesn't have it and hasn't been exposed yet to bring those value-added discussions to the table.
Okay, thank
Great
you.
point. And I'm just going to add one detail here. We've kind of talked about how these various categories of stakeholders within the company can add perspective, and on Joe's slide here, we have just various dimensions of things that people need to consider and take into account when trying to do the math. Joe, my question for you is, how fluid do you find that listing? I mean, do you see that changing rapidly, yearly, over time, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my approach, or our approach, and I've worked with a couple different organizations who have grown, is that you always have to anchor yourself and make sure that your strategy and what you're trying to do in growing the company is aligned with how your back office support is, and risk management office is part of the engine to support that growth. So I've always attempted to ensure that my operational leadership understands what they can and can't do with risk management, right? And make it a business discussion, not an insurance discussion.
Fantastic.
I have, if I may, Ashish, I had a question pop up. It's kind of a two-part question. It's, we're a growing $10 million revenue company. Two things. One, how can this process help us? As we seem to be on the smaller scale of the companies that would use this. And then secondly, how would we go about it? I mean, is there a strategic risk management for dummies book that we pick up and go through each chapter? What guidance would you give on that for let's say a smaller to medium-sized business, and how they would go about it?
Go ahead, AC.
Yeah, so great question. I mean, I think that's part of what we're going to kind of cover as we go through this whole thing. I mean, the whole framework that we're going to be talking about and we're walking through is just, it doesn't matter what size your enterprise or operations are. You have these things and considerations that you need to manage your company, right? There's so many different things. And, I think in a prior slide where Joe showed all the different stakeholders in a company, well, if your company is $10 million, maybe there's one person that's holding multiple roles there, right? They may have to look at various things and wear multiple hats. But the key thing, and that's kind of what we're showing here on the slide, is that, depending on who the stakeholders are and what their responsibilities are for a firm, and depending on how mature your enterprise or operation is, you may have one set of people responsible for driving the company objectives, and you may have a different person driving towards, managing risk for that operation. But the key thing here is, what if those two objectives and thoughts were in alignment? Think about how powerful that could be for your enterprise or operation. So Casey, to that question, hey, if I'm a $10 million organization, what does this all mean to me, and who should I do? Who should I consult? I think the information is there, and the framework we're presenting is scalable, that you can have it apply to you as you see fit, and get the same results out of it for you and your company, depending on where you are as a stage of a company.
AC is going to walk through in the next couple of slides quickly, just a high level of a potential process you may use, but actually there's some practicality to it because, you know, with smaller organizations, Casey, you know, you may have your CEO or owner leading the charge, and he or she may be walking down and talking to the sales leader, and then they get walk down and talk to the HR leader, and they're not sure if and tell those two to talk to each other about this topic. Well, they're very busy because they're wearing multiple hats, and they may never talk to each other about the topic that the CEO wanted them to speak, because you're looking at it in very much a siloed approach, right? Maybe we're talking about the CEO wants to grow sales, but the salesperson wants to do that, but the CFO is thinking about, well, what kind of credit limits are we going to offer? Well, in terms of accounts receivable protection and things of that nature. Well, you got to get those group team in the same room together so that everybody's comfortable. And we think, and credit risk is just one of many things that are identified. We think that's why it's worth, whether you do it twice a year or once a year, to really get in the room and say, we're going to talk about our insurance ecosystem, our risk management ecosystem. And then all of a sudden you're having business conversations that are anchored there. And so the smaller companies really can be of great value. And I think the CEO may find out a lot about their leadership team as well when they exit, having been through those meetings.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Back to you, Ashish. Did you have something else you wanted to bring up, or another slide?
Yeah, so Casey, you'd asked about, where can people get information? So you'd asked if there's a Risk Management for Dummies book. I think I'm going to present something that's probably core to every one of those books you'll see here. So maybe I'll save you the expense of needing to get that. But there's people who go to school to specifically learn risk management, but it all boils down to one real process, and we'll kind of walk through it here. So it's five steps to this process. And step one is to identify, where you really look in the mirror and you kind of look and identify all the different things that could impact your organization. Step two is to analyze it. You put some quantitative value on each element you've identified in step one. Step three, you've gone through this and you say, okay, I've identified it, I put some value on it, and now I evaluate it. What does this mean to my organization? What kind of impact can this be? If you look at that chart that I showed on an earlier slide, that severity and magnitude, it's one of those things that you can understand and plot out and map out, what does this mean to me? 4, treat the risk. So if untreated, the impact of event X to my firm is Y. So what steps do I need to take to reduce that magnitude? And then the last step of that process is basically wash, rinse, and repeat. Basically monitor, review the risks, and see how those decisions that you made or assessments you made impacts your organization. So that's a Risk Management for Dummies book in one slide there, Casey.
Awesome. That works for me.
So, you go through that process. I think this is the chart I was speaking to before. You can build out this thing. It's graph paper. On the y-axis, so you have severity, what's the amount of impact that something could have. And on the x-axis, you have frequency. How likely is this to occur? And you can bucket your findings into 4 categories: finance, prevent, assume, and mitigate. So if you find something that's going to be low likelihood of happening, but high severity, that's something that insurance is probably going to be available for you to procure and help manage it using that. But sometimes you might have something that's high likelihood and high severity. And that's something insurance is just not going to be available. And so your response as an enterprise or organization is really to take steps to prevent those things from happening. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have things that are low severity, but either of low frequency, which are things that you should assume as an organization, or things that happen with some degree of frequency, and then you have to mitigate those risks. So that's a good textbook way of understanding what to do with this information. So it doesn't matter what size of enterprise you are, this is a framework that's still applicable to you. This slide I like. It's round, it's circled, right? So just like the Knights of King Arthur's court, there was no one area that's more important than another. So whatever your risk, so you can bucket risks into financial risks, hazard risks, strategic, and operational. And you can see in here, and this is fluid and changes by organization, but you'll see things in here that if you refer back to Joe's slide earlier, that showed the things that make up your components of risk, you can bucket this. Now, these are not hard and fast buckets. These things are something can be both operational and strategic, but maybe has one predominance over the other. And so once you find all this and assess what's the impact of of all these risks, you can take some action and see what you can do that will help your enterprise. So with that, here's an example. So a company was asking themselves, should we look into use of a captive to help their organization? And a captive is something that's basically an insurance company that you own for yourself, okay? And there's a lot, it's not a straightforward answer whether or not you can do this and whether or not it makes sense for your organization. But here is where an enterprise went through the process and went to the various stakeholders within an organization, meaning regulatory, tax, compliance, legal, and getting their input. And they went through and they mapped out, like, what is the frequency of this becoming an issue for us? And correlate that with what is the magnitude of this? And you went through this and you can see how you map it all out. You come up with, and this isn't just one person within an organization, typically. It's not just one person. This is really a sophisticated process that you go through and get input and perspective from all the different people within your organization. And you need to do that because sometimes you may be myopic from where you're sitting and may not see something that's outside, I guess they call that a blind spot, right? And so you've mapped this all out and you can see, what you distill out of this. And this is something that was used for a strategic risk, right? If you go back to my prior slide, we talked about the various quadrants of risk. The decision to use a captive as part of your organization is something that falls into strategic, where maybe there's some risk, but maybe there's some reward behind that as well too. And you can see what distills out of that is regulatory and compliance were the two issues that just were identified within this organization. So it's a process that works. Maybe the person who's in charge of the enterprise may have seen it or may not, but using this gives you a framework to make a decision.
Now, just to add to that, so you think about if you're a smaller organization, this happened to be an output of a larger organization who was going through a big picture strategic planning process, and this was the risk component. If you're a smaller organization, you're still going to ask the same questions that were asked to evaluate and capture the data. You may not need to put a graph in the quadrants and go through this because you may be worrying about straight cash flow because cash is king and we want to make sure we're able to meet the next 12 months or next 24 months from a capital perspective. Well, this same data can be used. You can bring your executive team into the room and stack rank them 1 to 10 and have a conversation. I mean, literally make it as practical as that and say, okay, we need to worry about these safety issues. We're not in compliance with certain items. We have a succession issue where our HR department needs, who's the backup for our current leader of HR, things of that nature. A process will cause you to take a time out, turn down the noise of the day-to-day operations and say, what would we do if something like this happened? And I think this is way, if you have leadership meetings, on a weekly or a monthly basis, you could commit a 1 hour conversation to this, which will lead to others. So there are some practicalities back to what Casey said before about how, if I'm a smaller organization, how do I make some process like this work? You clearly can. It's not a large of investment in time and resource, but it can bode well for some decision making that you as a leader of your company need to be making going forward.
And that's exactly right. It's scalable. It's actually scalable, and then you can make it as complex or as basic as your needs, to suit your needs. So actually, great point there. Thanks, Joe. Mm-hmm. So with that, I think I got another polling question.
I think we have the last of our polling questions. Thanks, Ashish. All right, let's see it come up. This will be, what is the predominant view of risk and insurance in your organization? Is it a necessary evil that you work to negotiate the lowest price on policies and that's kind of it? Secondarily, is it broker-based suggestions, ideas, and so on come from outside the organization? Third, a CFO insurance buyer internally works with the team to keep things safe and compliant. Or fourth, it's incorporated, the risk and insurance is incorporated as part of the strategic plan and long-term objectives of the organization. Interesting to hear everybody's answer on that. We'll give it about 20 more seconds so people can answer the questions and go from there. And we would be interested in hearing if some people have, I think we have a couple other questions coming up, but let's look at the results of the poll first before we go on to some of the other things. Okay, so 50% of the respondents say the predominant view of risk and insurance in their organization is number one, a necessary evil. They work to negotiate the lowest price on policies. And then it's split up relatively even. The next is broker-based. Suggestions, ideas come from outside the organizations, about 25%. And then some, the CFO, insurance buyer, or it's incorporated as the whole part of the strategic plan, long-term objectives. Call me confused, or maybe just someone that's willing to poke the bear a little bit. But compared to the first, the answers to the first questions, this seems almost reversed. Am I wrong on that? Ashish, Joe, are you with me?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely, this is more consistent with what we've seen across the country and not just lower middle market companies, but larger organizations, this answer. And I think that kind of gets to the point of, managing your P&L as an expense and a necessary evil in compliance. But if you really take the full cost of risk, which we have a slide here coming up, our average math, if you think 10% of sales, if you're a $50 million organization and you do your total cost of risk and say you are at the 10%, that's $5 million a year fully baked that you're spending time in. A 1% change can bring $500,000 of cash into your bottom line. That's not small, right? And there's limited resources, and you want to allocate those resources accordingly. And that's why a comprehensive approach is important. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, Casey, I agree with you, Casey. I mean, this was a surprising turn. We had such an optimistic group and such a very, I was very excited by a lot of the first answer, but I think we may have had one mea culpa come through saying that they accidentally clicked the wrong answer. So maybe that we probably still have the good group that we thought we had at the outset. So, but I agree with your assessment there, Casey.
Right.
Okay, thanks, Ashish. Do we have, I think we have a couple more slides to target.
Yeah, we had our first question around COVID and, these one-time events, the black swans, if you will, that AC spoke to are driving tough decisions. I think our point here is, regardless of which area you've fallen into, make sure you evaluate your current risk profile. If you're restructuring your organization, your ability and what you're spending on risk management needs to change. So you might have a current risk management philosophy, platform, insurance coverage. If you're restructuring, go back and look at that, because there's probably dollars to be saved, either directly through a change in the insurance or indirectly because you're going to approach your business differently and apply your current investment in insurance that way. If you're looking to become an acquirer and you see this time as an opportunistic approach to go through and evaluate, make sure you understand when you're evaluating that target enterprise, bringing them into the fold when you integrate them, how do they impact your risk profile, the way you approach risk? There may be some different philosophies in terms of how the plants get run, how the sales organization behaves or is compensated, and other things that are tied into risk management. You want to make sure you find those and they become part of the valuation. We heard there's not many people on the other side. We do have a lot of organizations throughout the country that have, unfortunately, this has been such a challenge where they've had to think about selling the company or looking for additional investors. You want to make sure your risk management, get yourself ready for sale. Make sure your things are in order, because a good acquirer is going to ask you those questions. And the fact that that's in order is an example of a well-run organization and very thoughtful, and actually will drive more value for you as a seller when you're trying to get the proper enterprise value. So just make it part of the overall process.
Joe, do you think that there's companies that have gone through this process, taking COVID aside and black swan conversations aside, do you think there's companies that have done this and are ready for times like this because they've gone through the process and prepared to be ready when something like an opportunity like this has presented itself?
Yes, I think, I guess, a couple of points there. First and foremost, someone who views risk management strategically and has short-term goals that are measured, it will, and building towards that goal, it will come out in how your plants are run, your service model, your value proposition, because it's one of those elements that you've had tidied up. So you will have more value, and you don't have work to do if you're preparing for sale. Those companies who go through the process of acquiring and look at this, I will tell you, I've been at the desk and will say, boy, you have a unhealthy organization from an employee benefits perspective. And as a result, your healthcare benefits are not as strong as they need to be. Well, as a result, they may use that as part of the negotiate. When I say unhealthy, meaning there's a lot of investment going in there, investment directly from the company or investment going directly from your employees as they're trying to pay for benefits, right? And understanding that. So you don't want to be on the wrong side of the discussion. At a minimum, you want to prepare yourself for the discussion. You may be on the wrong side, but if you proactively find out you're on the wrong side and figure out a way to remedy that, that will bode well for any negotiations that you have in a buy-sell.
Right. So I think that goes back to your earlier point, embracing all the components that makes up your enterprise, and seeking their input and bringing in and bringing it in alignment with your company or
right.
organization's objectives, right?
Yeah, and I think the other part of this is that the items we're talking about here are industry agnostic. I mean, all organizations. Yes, the type of risk might be a little bit different, but the foundational framework of risk is the same, right? And you're going through decision making. You want to gather data. You want to make smart decisions. So whether you're in the service business, whether you're manufacturing, whether you're in other elements of service related or manufacturing related companies, this does apply, and it's just a matter of where you want to spend your time and resources to get it fixed. And that's why you got to take a comprehensive look.
Yeah.
And where you are in the growth curve too.
So what you're saying, I think, also is that those four quadrants we talk about, they exist for everybody. It's what changes enterprise by enterprise and what industry you're in is what you fill in those various quadrants, right? You have to pick and identify, what does this mean to me strategically, operationally, or hazard-wise, and be able to bucket it that way.
That's right. That's right. And that's why when you go through, you bring your team in to have a conversation who knows your business hopefully just as well, or you're trying to train up your leadership on how well you know your business. That initial sit down and having a conversation and sharing information, it's an assessment process that you go through. And you probably do this in a lot of other areas of your company. You just haven't thought that, could I use the same approach on the risk management side, which really comes back to the ultimate framework of what we were trying to talk about today, which approach risk management differently. Think about it as strategic versus compliance. Of course, your current year expense is important and very meaningful, right? But what is your multi-year plan on getting your benefits or your property lines more competitive in the market? It's an investment. You have to make investments versus expense. Do you want to make the plant safer, or do you want to buy more insurance, right? Because your plant's not safe.
You're saying it's not a necessary evil, right?
Right. Correct. Correct. That's the way we like to approach, with our clients, and we think it's a proper approach in the holistic view of managing your organization. And number 3 there, establishing short-term goals that are really anchored in your strategic plan. If you have, what we call the noise here, you have so much going on. You want to take care of a customer, or maybe you're a contractor, you got a job. These events are very emotional and very critical to the current operations, and you're going to address them. But don't let them change your strategic view of this unless you've made the decision it's so big, you have to change the overall strategic view of the company.
First of all, thank you very much, Joe and Ashish, for that. There is a question, that kind of a 2-part question, but I'll say anecdotally, any of us who have ever dealt with family-owned businesses, and let's say it's the husband and wife that both have the business and so on. I've made it about 5 years ago. I started saying right from the beginning, Fred, Mary, any question Fred asks me, I'm going to carbon copy you both on my response. Mary, any question you ask me, Fred's going to get a response to know that we're talking about this, because I can count on, too many hands and toes, the amount of times where one spouse was talking to me about something and there was no communication whatsoever with the other spouse. And unfortunately, things went south. And when you think about it just in such a small term of a relationship like that, and you're looking at an organization of even 20, 50, 100 employees with managers in different areas, it can just get crazy if they're not communicating. So that's my little anecdote, but I'm curious. The question is, what does day 1 of an enterprise risk assessment look like? What is day 2? How much time commitment is there on the behalf of an organization to do it? And I know you said it's kind of industry agnostic, but are there particular reasons why one industry doesn't do it very much or another? So the question is kind of like, what does this look like? What's the framework? And any comments on why one group of people seems to do it more than others?
Yeah, I will tell you, there's a day 0 first before we get to day 1. Day 0 is going to be a very intimate conversation with the leader of the organization, right? And that may be an hour conference call, right? To understand, what do you want to accomplish? What's the maturity level and focus areas of your team? So you're going to do that, Casey, to get aligned with what he or she as the leader wants to accomplish, or the sponsor of this activity, depending upon the size of the organization. That leads to day 1. And day 1 can easily be done. We've done things where it's a half a day conversation to a full day of activity, right? Which leads then to additional tasks and cross-functional activity. Very much for those who have gone through a strategic planning process, it's very similar framework that you're going to go through. The key here is, as much as we are passionate about risk management, it still has to serve its place, right? It's not going to lead a conversation. It needs to be part of the conversation. It could in certain subsets. So I'd say day 0, then day 1, right? And then that leads to the breadth of where it incorporates in your organization's plan.
Yeah, let me add to that by saying, there's a lot of prep work that goes between that day 0 and day 1, right? Where you kind of identify what it is you want to get done, and building a custom process to make for an efficient day 1 and day 2. You want to have the right stakeholders at the meeting, and it really looks like a workshop, where you have a basically a risk inventory that you go through and be able to talk and have a discussion where various stakeholders from different parts of an organization come into that meeting to add and contribute to that perspective. So a lot of work that gets to between day 0 and day 1.
Are there any particular industries that you guys feel, oh my God, you're just shooting yourself in the foot if you don't even touch this? Or are you of the opinion that, hey, this is industry agnostic? If you've got an organization of more than one person, and even if it's just you, maybe you need to have this conversation with yourself and go through the process. Gentlemen?
Yeah. Casey, I think it's more the latter to your say, but in terms of agnostic, I would say having the foresight to look outside of your four walls, and you talk about your vertical integration and going to your supplier world, right? And how things flow, and your customer, right? I mean, you exist because of your customers and the need, but understand, do you have risks with your customers, and how are you going to change that? Sometimes, once again, it is part of the risk, right? We just call it customer concentration, right? Or how are we going to grow sales? Well, that's a risk, right? And it all needs to be managed.
Do you feel, we talked about this a little earlier in terms of advisors, that a lot of times we don't leverage the advisors as much as possible. Any particular way you have found when you were a CFO, how you could get, more out of your advisor? Was it simply just, hey, I need more help, I need help in these areas, just having a conversation with them and setting expectations on what you want? Or what would you suggest?
My approach has always been, and I got this growing up at Ernst & Young when I was on the other side, is I worked hard to confirm whether my advisor understood my business. And you can really get there pretty quickly. If I was uncomfortable that my advisor didn't really understand my business, then that advisor's there for transaction activity. They're not there as a strategic advisor. So I literally would ask them questions, Casey, right? What do you think about this customer? Did you see this acquisition here, right? Hey, I have this issue in the plant. Why don't you come out and talk? And if they had no idea, Casey, right, then I knew their role. So my point to answer your question is, hold your advisors accountable, right? Hold your advisors accountable. Do they understand your business? Really at the level for them to be an advisor. That's been my experience.
Great point. Great point. So yeah, in serving clients, clients need to hold them to higher standards and to expect more, and not just have the relationship that's transactional, where they see somebody once a year, 2 days before their insurance renewal, where they get stuck with a bill, an increase of 20%, no explanation other than, yeah, it's tough out there, and have a nice day.
Correct.
Okay. Any other questions? Let me check to see if there's any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. We're coming up on 2 o'clock. Ashish or Joe, any final comments you'd like to make?
I mean, I think it's just really, like I said, it's a great group of people, based on some of the answers and questions that we had here. I think, it sounds like, in some form or fashion, maybe the companies the clients are doing it. I think it's just really amazing, and we're speaking from experience here, the amount of stuff you can leverage once, these issues are aligned, when you have your operational and risk management functions, working in the same direction. And so however you do it, I mean, this process will help you get there.
Okay, well, we're approaching 2 o'clock. I want to thank Joe and Ashish definitely for participating and sharing your insight with respect to this. Thanks to the CEO Leadership Forum for making this available. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe we're going to have a webinar on July 9th, but I'm just curious, Jeff, can you confirm we're going to have a copy of this, and we'll send out a recording of this if anybody needs it? Is that correct?
Yes, I will send it out probably tomorrow, and
Okay.
there will also be a few links so you could access both that and a PDF file of the presentation.
Awesome. Jeff, thank you so much for putting this together. Attendees, thanks again for your participation. We look forward to talking with you on July 9th, and be safe out there. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.